Kia ora koutou and good morning, everyone. There's a lovely line in the opening page of Kenneth Grahame's book, The Wind in the Willows, which reads, Spring was moving in the air above and in the earth below and around him, penetrating even his dark and lowly little house, with its spirit of divine discontent and longing. I like the way Kenneth Grahame puts that. Springtime does carry with it a spirit of divine discontent and longing. Discontent with the winter, and longing for the summer. Divine discontent is a kind of holy dissatisfaction with the way things are. We experience divine discontent when we're not living according to the deepest longing of our soul. In The Wind in the Willows, Mole has been doing his spring cleaning and can't stand it any longer. He must go above ground and roll in the grass in warm sunshine. Spring answers his longing for winter to end and summer to begin. Today we continue our sermon series in the life of Joseph, focusing on Genesis chapter 43, verses 15 to 34. In this passage we see the deep longing of Joseph and his brothers rising to the surface. From verse 15 of Genesis 43, we read, So the men took the gifts and double the amount of silver, and Benjamin also. They hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, Take these men to my house, slaughter an animal and prepare dinner. They are to eat with me at noon. The man did as Joseph told him and took the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house. They thought, We were brought here because of the silver that was put back into our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys. So they went up to Joseph's steward and spoke to him at the entrance to the house. Please, sir, they said, we came down here the first time to buy food, but at the place where we stopped for the night, we opened our sacks and each of us found his silver, the exact weight, in the mouth of his sack. So we have brought it back with us. We have also brought additional silver with us to buy food. We don't know who put our silver in our sacks. It's all right, he said. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. Then he brought Simeon out to them. The steward took the men into Joseph's house, gave them water to wash their feet, and provided fodder for their donkeys. They prepared their gifts for Joseph's arrival at noon because they had heard that they were to eat there. When Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, How is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? They replied, Your servant, our father, is still alive and well. And they bowed low to pay him honor. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out and, controlling himself, said, Serve the food. They served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to Egyptians. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. When portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. May the Spirit of Jesus illuminate God's word for us. David Augsburger, the late Anabaptist theologian, once wrote, "Ontologically, chocolate raises profoundly disturbing questions. Does not chocolate offer natural revelation of the goodness of the Creator, just as chilies disclose a divine sense of humor? Is the human born with an innate longing for chocolate? Does the notion of chocolate preclude the concept of free will?" As a chocolate lover, this quote makes me smile. It's not often you find a theologian with a sense of humor. David is basically saying that chocolate is hard proof that God exists and God is good. The reality is we human beings have many desires and longings which often seem to compete for our attention. Some of those desires we might judge as wrong or evil, and others as virtuous or good. For example, we might judge eating chocolate as bad. I don't think that, but some people carry a great deal of misplaced guilt about chocolate. Whether you deem chocolate to be good or evil, you have to ask yourself, what deeper longing is my desire for chocolate pointing to? The very fact that many people love chocolate shows that human beings have a deep longing for God. For if we long for the goodness of chocolate, it logically follows our longing can only be satisfied through a right relationship with the one who made us to enjoy chocolate. Or to put it another way, it doesn't matter how much chocolate you eat, your longing will never be fully satisfied except through an encounter with the living God. Back in Genesis 37, you may recall how Joseph's brothers plotted to get rid of Joseph. They hated Joseph because he was Jacob's favorite. The brothers' desire to kill Joseph was not good in itself, but we have to ask ourselves, why did they want to do that? What deeper longing was driving their desire to destroy Joseph? Maybe it was the desire to be loved. Maybe on some level they thought, if we get rid of Joseph, then our dad will have more love for us. But that is not how love works. Love multiplies by giving. Love does not grow by taking. When the brothers sold Joseph into slavery, they only reduced their father's capacity for love. Perhaps the greatest impediment to love is fear. And Joseph's brothers know all about fear. They have lived with it for over 20 years. In Genesis 43, verse 18, we read, "Now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house. They thought, we were brought here because of the silver that was put back into our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys." It's amazing how fear can distort our thinking. Fear tends to disconnect us from our deepest longings. It makes our thinking smaller somehow, so that all we can imagine is our own harm. Why would someone as rich and powerful as the Prime Minister of Egypt be interested in their scrawny donkeys? Surely the ruler of the land has bigger fish to fry. Moved by a longing for peace of mind, the brothers front up to the steward of Joseph's house and tell him the truth. "We did not steal the silver last time we were here. Somehow it ended up back in our sacks. We don't know how. Here it is." And Joseph's servant says in reply, "It's all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." The steward's opening phrase, "it's all right," is just one word in the original Hebrew, shalom. Shalom means peace, wholeness, and well-being in all aspects of your life, especially your relationships. The brothers are afraid. They long for peace, and the steward answers that longing saying, "God has given you treasure in your sacks." One of the deepest longings of the human soul is the longing to know that God is with us and for us, that he loves us. Joseph's brothers did not believe that God was with them. They thought God was against them because of what they did to Joseph. They thought God was out to get them. They had been looking over their shoulder in fear for decades. The brothers have become so alienated by their guilt that they don't really believe the God of their father Jacob is also their God. But their wrongdoing does not stop God from being God. The God of their father is still their God. It's the same with us. Our moral failure does not stop God from being God. Our straying off track and getting lost in a spiritual sense does not prevent God from pursuing us with his love. Nor does it derail God's purpose. When the steward says, God has given you treasure in your sacks, he's not just talking about silver. The silver is a metaphor for something far more valuable than mere money. It's like the steward is saying, God has put treasure in the sack of your soul. The treasure is in you and in your relationships, and the treasure is God's grace. Joseph was Jacob's favorite. Perhaps that made the other brothers feel less valuable, less lovable in some way, but they're not less to God. The brothers have divine treasure in them as well, even if Jacob, their earthly father, does not see it or acknowledge it. The message to the brothers and to us is clear. No matter how worthless we might feel because of what we have done or what has been done to us, we are intrinsically valuable because God has made us that way. Like the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Corinthians, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. It's not your looks or your charm or your achievements or your reputation or your bank balance or anything you do that make you rich. You are rich because you are loved by God. The treasure is in you. Okay, so Joseph's brothers had some deep longings for peace and love, longings that could only really be satisfied by God. What about Joseph himself? What did he long for? John Ortberg, another Christian author, says this about longing. The human longings that are deep inside of us never go away. They exist across cultures. They exist throughout life. When people were first made, our deepest longing was to know and be known. And after the fall, when we all got weird, it's still our deepest longing, but it's now also our deepest fear. What John Ortberg is talking about here is intimacy. To know another human being and to be known and accepted by them in turn is the definition of intimacy. Into me, see. Each of us has a deep longing for intimacy. The desire for physical intimacy points to a deeper longing for emotional intimacy. Intimacy of soul, mind, and spirit, a genuine sharing of oneself with another. Sadly, fear gets in the way of developing intimacy. We get hurt in this life, and our hurt makes it harder to risk making ourselves vulnerable. If fear is left unchecked, it shuts us down and closes us off from knowing others and revealing our true selves. What if others don't like who I am? The longing for intimacy runs deep in all of us, but some are more in touch with their longing than others. Certainly Joseph longed for intimacy. He wanted to know his brothers and he wanted them to know him. The question was, could he trust them or not? we see something of Joseph's desire for intimacy in the way he asks after his brothers and father in verse 27. He asked them how they were, shalom. And then he said, how is, shalom, your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? Twice more the Hebrew word shalom pops up, this time from the lips of Joseph. In asking after his brothers and father, Joseph is actually inquiring after their shalom, their well-being, their peace. This is more than a simple how's it going. Joseph genuinely wants to know his family is okay. He cares about them. He loves them. Notice also how verse 27 is framed. In verses 26 and 28, all 11 brothers bow down to honor Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph at this point, but we, the readers, can see that Joseph's dream, all those years before, of his brothers bowing to him, is being fulfilled. The interesting thing here is that Joseph does not care about his brothers bowing and scraping. He cares about them and their shalom, their well-being. What Joseph really wants, and always wanted probably, is a life-giving connection with his brothers. Joseph longs for intimacy. Being Jacob's favorite had isolated Joseph. It alienated him from his brothers. They hated him for it. Joseph longs for warmth, belonging, acceptance, and understanding from his brothers. Most of all, though, Joseph longs for his brother Benjamin. When Joseph sees Benjamin, his only full-blooded brother, he gives Ben a blessing, saying, God be gracious to you, my son. In the Hebrew culture of the time, this was no small thing. This blessing carried real weight. It had gravity, but it's also full of affection. Rather tellingly, in verse 30, we read how Joseph was deeply moved at the sight of his brother Benjamin. Joseph is moved to tears, in fact, and must run out of the room to compose himself. Has that ever happened to you? Have you been ambushed by tears in the same way? Quietly going about your day only to be triggered by a familiar sight or smell that somehow puts you in touch with a deeper longing. Our spiritual life, to use Ignatian language, is characterized by times of desolation, times of consolation, and times of normality. In times of desolation, we feel like God is absent and our lives seem empty, but also heavy at the same time. My God, why have you forsaken me? Joseph certainly had his times of desolation. But then come the times of consolation, when we feel God's presence so close and tender. In those moments of intimacy with God, something shifts inside us and we may be moved to tears. It is difficult to know whether the tears are releasing pain or joy or both. We only know we don't want the consolation to end, but we cannot control it. Consolation is visited on us by God's grace. All we can do is make space for it, treasure it for the gift that it is, and remember it, especially in the times when feelings of desolation return. Joseph's tears bear a close resemblance to the tears of consolation. He is so in touch with his deep longing for intimacy that he can feel God's presence, and it undoes him in the best way possible. Genesis 43 finishes with the brothers feasting and drinking freely with Joseph and each other. And even though Joseph has shown favoritism to Benjamin by giving him 5 times as much food as anyone else, there is no hint of envy or resentment. This is a picture of shalom, the kind of peace which makes room for intimacy, the kind of easy companionship they had all been longing for. A few days ago, I felt like eating some vanilla wine biscuits. It happens every once in a while. It wasn't so much that I was physically hungry. I had chocolate biscuits in the cupboard, but strangely, I did not feel like eating chocolate biscuits that day. I put it down to missing my grandparents. You see, when I was a kid, my nana and pop would give me vanilla wines alongside home baking whenever I went to visit. My hankering for vanilla wines was really a longing for them, in a way. What do you long for? Most of the time, we're too busy, too pressured, or too focused on a screen to be in touch with our inner longings. If that's you, then perhaps a better question to ask might be, what's your vanilla wine? What simple, ordinary thing do you hunger for? What movie do you keep watching again and again? What place do you daydream about when life is soulless and draining? What memory do you keep on repeat? What comfort food do you find sanctuary in? Those seemingly superficial desires may be pointing to a deeper longing within you. Be gentle with your longing. Don't judge it or condemn it. When I think about it, my longing for my grandparents is really a holy discontent with death. Deep down, we each have a yearning for resurrection. We want the springtime of abundant life to prevail over the winter of loss. We long for the summer of God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. God understands that about us. God knows our longing, which is why he sent Jesus. In and through Christ, our deepest human longings are fulfilled. What do you long for? The heart of prayer is longing, perhaps longing for wholeness, longing for atonement, longing for peace, longing for redemption, longing for intimacy, longing for love, longing for resurrection life, longing for God. When the Apostle Paul says pray without ceasing, he doesn't mean talk to God non-stop. He means be honest about your longings. Stay in touch with what really matters to you, because that is where you will find God's purpose. That is where God will answer the longing of your soul with his presence. May the Lord give you the desires of your heart. Amen.